Hello and welcome to the Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society interview series with prominent authors and historians specializing in the colonial period and Revolutionary America. My name is Christian Despina, and today we're fortunate to be joined by our guest host, J.L. Bell, author of The Road to Concord, How Four Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, and also the creator of the popular blog, Boston 1775. Now, colonial Boston was not only a hub of revolutionary activity, but also a place filled with superstitions where lurid tales permeated every corner of society, from fantastical stories of ghosts and spirit hauntings to the more barbaric reality of executions and murders. Today, we speak with an author and historian who brought some of those stories back to life in vivid and accurate detail, who also happens to run one of Boston's great repositories of history.
D. Brenton Simons is President and CEO of the New England Historic Genealogical Society. Under his leadership, the NEHGS has served as the anchor location of the PBS television series Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Simons is also the nonfiction history author who specializes in the history of pre-federal Boston and genealogical art and iconography. His books include Witches, Rakes and Rogues, The True Stories of Scam, Scandal, Murder, and Mayhem, 1620 to 1775, and Boston Beheld, Antique Town and Country Views. Brenton, thank you for taking the time to speak with us, and welcome to the show.
My pleasure. Thank you, JL. Thank you, Christian.
Let's start out by getting to know you a little. How did you discover the study of family history, and how did you decide to pursue it as a career? And can you discuss some of the genealogical work that you have prepared for notable individuals such as presidents?
Yeah, sure. Well, it really was in my blood. All four of my grandparents were interested or even quite deeply involved in genealogy. And so I grew up in two households, both my maternal and paternal families, where genealogy was almost our form of communication with one another. And as a child, I remember wanting to hear the stories and enjoying visiting graveyards and repositories and looking at dusty old genealogies and trying to figure out lineages. So it was really in the fabric of who I am. And so my grandparents were involved in this, but it even goes much further back, really, and you have to go back to the 17th or 18th century in some of my New York Dutch lines. And I had an ancestor who is famous in genealogical terms named Annika Jan. She owned most of Lower Manhattan. And her heirs put together lawsuits over 200 years to reclaim some of the property. And it was one of my ancestors who in about 1800 formed one of these heirs associations. And so he did a lot of genealogy. By the way, I've got a portrait of the lady in question. This is Annika Jans. And anyway, my ancestor formed an heirs group, and then his son became a very active genealogist and published a genealogy in the 19th century. So when I say it goes way back, it goes really far back. Oh, and then in terms of famous people at the Society, so those who don't know us, New England Historic Genealogical Society, also known as American Ancestors, is the founding genealogical society in the Western world, really in the world. And over the past 175 years, we've published genealogies, most of them for anyone and everyone, ordinary people, if you will, but also ancestors of American presidents and famous people. So we literally publish a book called Ancestors of American Presidents. And John Quincy Adams was our first member, and many of the presidents since JQA have been members, including recent ones who've been very interested in their family history. And then every year we honor famous Americans and give them their genealogies. So Ken Burns and David McCullough and Doris Kearns Goodwin and people like that. And it's great fun. As I say, it's great fun to give America's storytellers their stories. And so that's something we've been doing for a long time. And then, as you mentioned, of course, working with Skip Gates on his very popular PBS series.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Brenton, because usually when somebody or one of us thinks about colonial Boston, slavery and slave retribution is not really the first topic that comes to mind. And in your book, which is Rakes and Rogues, you wrote about the tragedy of Dr. Joseph Warren's apothecary supplier, John Greenleaf, and the harrowing event that shook Boston in 1751. Can you tell us about what happened?
Yeah, well, the story really began with portraits, and in some ways ends with portraits. And what happened was, this story had been debunked, and debunked by no one less than the great Walter Mere Whitehill. So to tackle it and tell a different tale was formidable. But it started with a colleague at the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Museum at Colonial Williamsburg, who sent me a photograph of some of the portraits of the Greenleaf children, the children of Dr. John Greenleaf, who you just mentioned, and said, well, we know there used to be this story that the children were murdered or poisoned, and we know that's not true, but what did happen to them? And I started looking into the case, and it was such an odd rumor to have stuck to the family that they were poisoned and that their father was an apothecary. And I thought, well, it is plausible. And since there was absolutely no trace of these children beyond childhood, I thought, something must be up. And one of the genealogies alluded to them having been murdered. So through a chain of discovery, and it was really very complicated, too complicated to go into detail now, but through some lucky discoveries I made, I was able finally to discover the court files at the Mass State Archives, which had been frankly misfiled for 200 years. And then this yielded the whole story of how this young woman, 16 or 17 years old, named Phyllis, had purportedly poisoned 2 or possibly 3 of the Greenleaf children who died, and she was executed on the common. And in the wake of this, her mother was so traumatized by it. Phyllis's mother died, and it was just a real tragedy. And one of the stories was that there had been a little plaque on the common at the site commemorating this sad event. And maybe after Walter Mere Whitehill or someone decreed that it wasn't true, that was stripped away. And so I debunked the debunking and found out that this really did happen. And the reasons for it we'll never know. Phyllis pled guilty. There's very little by way of court documentation, but just the fact that Boston had forgotten, arguably America's history city, had forgotten this amazing case and believed it not to even be true, led me down a path which resulted in Witches, Rakes, and Rogues as a book, including witchcraft and tales of con artists and other things that had just been overlooked in Boston history.
That's terrific. Another story in Witches, Rakes, and Rogues, hopefully one that's a little lighter, concerns Nathaniel Wright, a merchant who went bankrupt in the start of 1765. And many New Englanders had invested their money with Wright, so his failure rippled across the society. And among the many other people who had to declare bankruptcy was Dr. Joseph Warren's widowed mother, Mary Warren of Roxbury. And then Dr. Warren himself ended up having to clean up Wright's estate after he died. But can you tell us the story of what Nathaniel Wright was up to with a woman named Miriam Fitch in 1762, a couple of years before he declared bankruptcy?
Yes, well, I wish I could say it was lighter, but it's not much lighter. This is the oldest con around, and in fact, it's still being practiced today. And after I tell you the story, I'll give you an example of how it's still very much in all our lives. But Wright had, as you know, married into the very prominent Apthorpe family of Boston, and he really was cut a bit of a figure in social Boston. And he, along with 2 other gentlemen, were given a proposal by Miriam Fitch. Miriam Fitch came to town and said her scheme was, for a small premium, and it wasn't so small, but for a premium, I will give you access to a large fortune. And this is the classic con. And so in her case, it was for a certain amount of gold coin, I will give you access to a chest of gold coins, which I don't think I'm going to be able to use, but you will be able to use. And so Wheelwright and his associates fell for this, and off Miriam Fitch and her accomplice guided them off to Bedford, where she lived with her husband and children. And they lived, they had a mill on the Shawshine River. And Miriam opened the door to the mill and said, "There's the trunk down there." And so Wheelwright and his associates went down into the bowels of the mill to retrieve the trunk. And of course, she promptly locked them in. And really, I think this was attempted murder, because of course, the only way she could have gotten away with this would have been if they died. And in fact, the floodgates would soon have been lifted and that compartment would have filled with water and they would have been drowned. But they clambered up the steps and screamed and shouted as Miriam ran off with their money. And of course, there was no trunk full of gold coins. This was a complete ruse. And were it not for the good luck of a passerby hearing the screaming and shouting, they would have been killed, but they were let out. Miriam and her accomplice were apprehended, and she and that fellow were made to sit in the town square in Boston with a placard on them saying "a cheat." And she also went to prison for 3 months. And so to fall for this unbelievable, what just seems such a flimsy proposition, might have indicated to some that Wheelwright's judgment was not the very best. And so this of course foreboded his ruin a short time later, as you said. But Miriam lived on. She lived for another 30 years and seemed to have overcome her brush with infamy in 18th century Boston. Oh, and then I was going to say, this scheme exists today because, you know, not a week goes by when I don't receive an email or usually a fax, and we still have a fax machine at the office, where someone will send, they're a lawyer or an estate representative in an exotic country, and so Simons has died and left a fortune of 27 million euros. And you will be the heir, but of course the next step is you need to wire them a finder's fee. And of course you'll never hear from them again. This is all a ruse. And I've said to my assistant, I'd be as wealthy as Bill Gates if all these fortunes devolved upon me. And of course, none of them have. The other smaller scale version, and we've all seen this by email, is you'll get an email from a friend saying, "I'm in desperate trouble. Get me an Amazon gift card immediately." And that's the small scale version of it. And of course, you know, people do that and then they've lost money. And so these schemes are alive and well. And that was one of the interesting things about writing the book, was that so many of the schemes being used in colonial Boston are still being used today. I mean, people coming to town and pretending to be people they're not, people in town pretending to be things they're not. Look at the Clark Rockefeller case, for example. So those colonial tricks live on.
Yeah, and you've kind of answered my next question, Scott, so I'm going to skip ahead to the question following that. And really what I wanted to ask you, because this is of personal intrigue to me, is that over the centuries, there have been disputes regarding the authenticity of a musket ball that came into the possession of NEHGS, which supposedly killed Dr. Joseph Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I figured you would probably ask about that, so I've got a little information on it, and it is a very interesting story. And there's a surprise answer, because whether or not it was the musket ball that killed Joseph Warren, it has a much bigger role in history, and it, through discussions of this musket ball, an institution, my society, was founded, which has affected all our lives and has affected American and worldwide culture by the creation of the discipline of genealogy. And from the creation of this institution, you get all of the activities in family history that are so prevalent today. So oddly enough, this musket ball was the source of discussion among the founders of the society prior to 1845. And And if I can just read you a little book. This is a book we just published called Family Treasures, which is by Gerald Ward, the curator, formerly of the Museum of Fine Arts. And it's about some of the items in our collections. And the musket ball in question is pictured here. And it's a lead musket ball. And there are arguments on both sides as to whether it was the ball that killed Joseph Warren or not. Joseph Warren's son-in-law, Benjamin Newcomb, I believe was his name, believed it was. And there are documents that tell of the story of how it was found. And so we'll never really know. There was a paper casing that goes with it, which is not in this photograph, which in the early days was said to be blood soaked. There doesn't appear to be any blood on it. Who knows? But I'll just read you this little passage. This important revolutionary relic is enhanced by its connection to the founding of the New England Historic Genealogical Society. In December 1843, William Henry Montague, son of the Reverend William Montague, encountered an acquaintance, Charles Ewer, who asked Montague to show him the musket ball. Montague invited Ewer to his home, and they reminisced about gatherings they had enjoyed over the years with other gentlemen interested in New England history. Montague then asked Ewer, "What is the reason that we cannot get up an institution, have it incorporated, so that it will live after us?" To which Mr. Ewer replied, "Yes, we can, and we will. What is to hinder us doing so?" Paper and pen were brought, and the men made a list of potential members of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, which was incorporated in March 1845, with Ewer as its first president and Montague as its first treasurer. William Henry Montague donated the musket ball to the organization in 1884. And if it is the musket ball that killed Joseph Warren, then it's doubly important, because not only did it lead incidentally to the founding of the first genealogical society, but of course it's a very important relic of the revolution. I think in all likelihood it was found on his body. There's certainly plenty of evidence for that, and affidavits that by reputable people. And after all, this wasn't the Antiques Roadshow where they were trying to sell something for money. This went to England with someone and only came back to America really by happenstance. But the chain of ownership and the documentation all the way along is strong, that it has an association, at least, with Joseph Warren and the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Wow. I've had the great pleasure of doing research at the Society, and there's just a terrific library. But what other non-book materials do you have? I understand there's fine art, there's manuscripts, what are the other treasures?
Sure. Well, of course, and I'm not sure if I said this at the top, but today we serve more than 340,000 members and millions of online users, and most people do know us for AmericanAncestors.org, which has 1.6 billion records online. So that's the way most people use us. But as you say, we have a building in Boston, and in non-COVID times, the public are welcome to visit it and not only use our incredible collections. We have 28 million manuscript items and resources really for every family, wherever they're from, not just New England. That's why we've rebranded as American Ancestors. But we also have these treasures, and the book I just showed you has a lot of them in it. They're paintings that are great. A favorite of mine is the portrait of Rebecca Rawson, who was the daughter of Edward Rawson, the secretary of the Mass Bay Colony, who married a rogue and was brought back to England. And there was this great saga about what happened to her. And in the mid-19th century, John Greenleaf Whittier came along and wrote a whole story about it, and which is this fascinating blend of fact and fiction. And a lot of people think that book is nonfiction. It is actually fictional, but he pulled so much history from that painting that it lives on. As I tell people, don't read the Wikipedia entry. It's all messed up. But we do tell the story of that portrait in this book, and I told it in Witches, Rakes and Rogues as well. So there were a lot of wonderful paintings, objects, John Hancock's wing chair, all kinds of things. And I invite the public to come visit us and have a look, or look online at AmericanAncestors.org, where we show things. Or if you really are interested, again, I'm going to plug the book because it's a great coffee table book written by a wonderful scholar, and it shows a little bit of everything that we have spanning the centuries.
Yeah. John, I'll yield the next question to you because I know you wanted to ask Brenton about genealogy moving online.
Well, you've spoken a bit about that, Brenton, and you've also spoken about the COVID-19 pandemic. And how has that affected genealogy? You've already started the process of serving people online. It's all the more important now for us to work at home if we can. Are there projects that have been put off or things that have been sped up because of the environment?
Yeah, a little of both, but the good news is that with people at home, now more than ever, our websites had record use, our membership is up, and so it has been very productive in terms of people going online and doing genealogy. We've been able to speed up some projects, like we have an exclusive arrangement with the Archdiocese in Boston to put up Catholic records 1790 to 1900, and we completed it 2 years in advance. We have a big project with the General Society of Mayflower Descendants and Family Search to put all the applications for the Mayflower Society online and make them searchable, because this is the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower. Right now is the sort of the prime time of that commemoration. And so, and in light of that commemoration, I'm also serving as the vice chair of the Governor Baker's State Commission for that anniversary. And we've, fortunately, almost everything has moved online. All the events we had planned have been morphed into online events. We have some events planned, in-person events planned for 2021, postponed from last April and other times over this year. But we hope we'll be able to carry those out in person, and if not, we'll make them virtual. So one way or the other, we are both for that commemoration and at the Society putting more online than ever before. We just had a talk with the BPL and our society and the Mass State Library with my colleague Ryan Woods interviewed Nathaniel Philbrick, and literally thousands of people tuned in to see that. So it's been a great time for scholarship. We've had published more books than ever before this year, a lot of them to do with the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower arrival, and also the Native American story, which was not told in 1920. We're embracing that story too, and publishing materials on behalf of and with the Wampanoag people. So a lot is going on, but just in different formats than it was expected to happen. The tough part is we're a relationship-oriented organization, and we miss seeing people. And I usually am on a plane every week going somewhere, and that's not possible right now. So visits like this really, in a way, are doing a great service to all our constituents and bringing people together when we can't do it in person.
Yeah, and we know it's affected so many people. But the last thing I wanted to ask you, Brenton, was we know that genealogical work has traditionally been a field defined by written historical records. So how has the New England Historic Genealogical Society made use of DNA testing, and what have been the results on that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and it's just been one of the absolutely burgeoning parts of our field over the last decade. And one of the people who, frankly, invented the tests that we're all taking, the geneticist Brian Sykes, has served on our council, and he's the author of The Seven Daughters of Eve and DNA USA. And we work closely with the providers, DNA providers, the test kit companies. And one of the things we do is we offer services when someone takes a test. What does it mean? What can they actually learn from it? And so that's a very popular service for an extension of what you get online. But we've done a lot of publishing on it too. And one of the things that's happening now is that people are making discoveries about themselves and their families. And we published a book called A Stranger in My Genes by Bill Griffith, who's was the host of Power Lunch and Closing Bell and Nightly Business Report. And he discovered through a DNA test several years ago that his father is not his father. And he approached me, told me this. He'd already written genealogies, and it turned out of the wrong family. But I said to him, Bill, if you're prepared to write this story, we will publish it. And we published it, and that's helped a lot of people, because while doesn't happen in every family, we've all heard stories about it. And even a few weeks ago, I was contacted by someone who is a distant cousin trying to identify her father. And I was able to help her figure out who her father is, and now father and daughter are reunited. So it's amazing. It's an amazing tool to find out a little bit more about our patrilineal and matrilineal ancestry. And then each company has these ethnicity probability offerings. So for example, in one of them, it says I'm 22% Scottish and 14% Swedish. I'm not sure those are the exact numbers, and those results vary from company to company because they're based on probabilities. But there are also parts of the test that are certainties, such as what your patrilineal and your matrilineal haplogroups are. And that is very helpful in genealogy. And so it's really been a boon to our society and to the field, and to everyone who wants to learn more about their ancient roots.
Yeah, and obviously that plays a role into these genealogical societies as far as the DAR, the SAR, Society of Cincinnati. Do you get a lot of requests for that?
Yes. Yeah, no, we do a lot of work for individuals who want to join hereditary societies. And we, in fact, just this year did some really remarkable DNA work to provide what I believe was the first lineage accepted into the Mayflower Society based on a DNA connection. We also, one of our staff researchers also made the discovery, again through DNA, that Winston Churchill has a Mayflower line that had not previously been known. So things like that are possible through DNA that we just wouldn't have expected. As I go around the country and meet people, I say, if there's anything you haven't told your family, this is the time to tell them, because DNA tests will reveal it. And of course, they're also being used in crime fighting, which is an amazing thing and has helped. The Golden State Killer was caught this way, and others. Yeah. And so it's had ramifications across culture and everyone's lives. It's been a very good thing.
Well, with that look at the past, present, and future of family history, we'll close today's interview with D. Brenton Simons, President and CEO of the New England Historic Genealogical Society and author of Witches, Rakes, and Rogues. Brenton, thanks so much for joining us, and we hope you'll come back.
I'd be delighted to. Thank you.
Yeah, and we hope you've enjoyed another in a series of Dr. Joseph Warren Historical Society interviews with authors and prominent historians. I'd like to thank D. Brenton Simons for making the time, and for J.L. Bell for joining us today. And to our viewers, on behalf of J.L. Bell and myself, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Okay.
All right.